But by 500 AD, so 500 years later, although there was a massive increase in church attendance and Christianity, people started to head for the desert for, as it were, kind of purer form of the faith. So you had what's called the Desert Fathers. They would go and they would pray in the desert. They would go and start a new community, just one or two people. Monks, the word monk literally means alone, but they would start to pray together in small communities. And you had the beginning of loads of monastic movements like the Benedictines, and you had the Celtic monasticism, you had St. Patrick, you had all of these heroes of faith who just started with a small band of people praying and keeping it simple and going back to their roots. So it was like a jam jar was smashed around 500 AD that released a whole load of mission in slightly alternative ways to just gathering and worshipping and singing. And then in 1054 AD, you had the Great Schism. So East and West divide. Again, that was like a jam jar smashing and people going in different directions. 1521, you had the Reformation. That was where the Bible used to be kind of taught in Latin. Nobody had a clue what was going on. And then the printing press came along, and you had Martin Luther, who started sharing the gospel and started sharing the Bibles in homes and in lots of places, and people started reading it for themselves. And so it's like the Bible got out of the jam jar, and so house movements began and other small communities began. And then about 250 years after that, you had Wesley, one of the biggest revivals, well, the biggest revival in the UK that's ever happened was Wesley and his brother and some friends who started praying. He was a small 5'4" Anglican minister who started going and preaching at the mines and started preaching in the pubs and started preaching in the fields. And instead of inviting everybody to an established church, he started small communities in these spaces where people lived. And that became an enormous network of small communities that totally transformed the UK. And a lot of that came out of the Reformation. So people could read the Bible for themselves. They could read the Bible in the pub. They could read it in their living room. And then, guess what? 500 years later, we find ourselves here today, 2025, 2026, 2027. Around that era, we are in a significant moment in history where it seems like there's a shift going on again. So we know from research that around 2,000 people a week around the world are leaving church, but not leaving God. It doesn't mean that all current forms of church are not right at all, but it's certainly opened up a big discussion about a mixed ecology of church. What does it look like to do church in loads of different forms? And when we go back to the early church, we can see in Acts 2:42 to 46 that we get a snapshot of what the early church looked like, and it said they met in homes, they were devoted to the apostles' teaching, they prayed together, they saw wonders and miracles, they shared their possessions. They kept it really simple. It didn't say that they bought a building and they set up loads of ministries and they ran lots of things. So we have pre-Christendom church, the early years. We have Christendom church, so 321 up to today, from which monasticism kind of begun as a little church within that church, as a kind of boiler room, and Wesley went and did small communities alongside the church, and that saw a massive shift. And then we have what we might call post-Christendom church, where we might say we're no longer an overtly Christian country. And what does it look like to worship today in a post-Christendom way? Well, I'd suggest it's a mixture of pre-Christendom and Christendom and all sorts of new ideas.